This is a work of complete cinematic fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely invented. He didn't even look at her when he said it. That was the part that broke something inside Elena Marlowe that no amount of careful breathing could fix. Roman Vale stood at the center of his own nightclub, his kingdom, stage, and when his lieutenant Dante leaned in and asked why a quiet woman like her had been given access to the inner circle, Roman Vale picked up his glass, swirled it once, and said 4 words that landed like a fist to the sternum. She means nothing to me. Not hesitation, not a flicker of guilt. Just 4 words and a sip of his drink. Elena was standing 12 feet away. She heard everything. If you've ever been the person in the room that someone reduced to nothing with a single sentence, stay with this story. Because what Elena did next changed everything, and what Roman Vale learned about the word nothing will take your breath away. If this story already has your heart beating faster, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell because we release stories like this every week, and you don't want to miss a single one. Drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the night Roman Vale made the worst mistake of his life. The rain had been coming down since 8 o'clock, the kind of heavy, relentless Chicago rain that turns the street outside into something you can't quite see through. It was a Thursday in late October, and Vault, the private nightclub on the near north side that Roman Vale had owned for 11 years, was doing what it always did on Thursday nights, making money, managing power, and keeping secrets. Elena Marlowe had been inside Vault exactly 43 times. She knew this because she kept a private journal that she'd started the week she first walked through those doors, and every entry had a date and a location and a short sentence describing why she was there. She wasn't sentimental by nature. She was precise. That precision was, ironically, the exact quality that had made Roman Vale trust her with everything: his contracts, his litigation strategy, his shell companies, the legal architecture of an empire built on things that couldn't be said aloud in a courtroom. She sat at the curved bar near the back, a glass of sparkling water in front of her that she hadn't touched. She was wearing a dark navy dress, simple, nothing remarkable. Elena had learned early in her time working for Roman that the goal was to be useful and invisible in equal measure. You didn't wear red to Roman Vale's club. You didn't draw attention. You showed up, you worked, you left. She had come tonight because Roman's chief lieutenant, Dante Reyes, had asked her to review a set of documents related to a real estate acquisition that needed to be finalized before the weekend. Standard work. She'd reviewed the papers in the back office, flagged 2 clauses that would have created liability, handed them to Dante's assistant, and was preparing to leave. That was when she heard Roman's voice cut through the low music. She paused near the corridor that opened onto the main floor, pulling on her coat, not looking in his direction. She didn't need to. She could place Roman in any room by sound alone, the particular cadence of his voice, the way he paused before a sentence when he was deciding how much to reveal. After 22 months of proximity, she knew his rhythms better than she knew her own heartbeat. What she hadn't expected was to hear her own name. "You keep bringing her in," Dante was saying, and his voice carried a particular tone. Elena recognized the testing tone, the one men in Roman's circle used when they were measuring something. People are starting to ask questions. Who she is. What she has on you. Roman's response came without any delay at all. No pause, no hesitation. "She means nothing to me." Elena went very still. Her hand was on the lapel of her coat, mid-button, and it just stopped. Her brain caught the sentence and turned it over the way you turn over something that doesn't quite look right. She waited for the rest of it, the qualifier. The "but she's useful," or the "she handles the legal work," or even the cold impersonal "she's an employee." There was nothing else. Dante said something she couldn't catch. Roman laughed, low and easy, and the conversation moved on. Just like that. 4 words and a pivot. The way you'd dismiss a piece of furniture you'd grown tired of. Elena finished buttoning her coat. She walked out of Vault, through the side exit, into the rain, without saying goodbye to anyone. She stood on the wet sidewalk for about 15 seconds, letting the rain hit her face, and she made a decision so quietly that it barely felt like a decision at all. It felt more like something clicking off inside her. A switch she hadn't known was running. She hailed a cab. She went home, She sat on the edge of her bathtub for a long time. Then she took the pregnancy test from the back of the cabinet under the sink, the one she'd bought 6 days ago and had been finding reasons not to open, and she finally used it. She stared at the result for 3 minutes without moving. Then she went to her desk, found a piece of stationery, and wrote 6 sentences in her careful, precise handwriting. She put the stationery and the test in an envelope. She did not seal it. She set it on her kitchen table and looked at it. She called a cab company she'd never used before and asked for a pickup at 5:30 in the morning. Then she started to pack. Roman Vale was not a man who operated on guilt. He'd excised that particular weakness sometime around his 24th year, when his father had put a gun in his hand and told him that sentiment was the only thing that could undo a man with power. Roman had learned the lesson the way he'd learned everything in his life, by watching what happened to the men who didn't. He ran his organization the way a surgeon runs an operating room. Clean, precise, no unnecessary movement. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats he wasn't willing to execute. He didn't explain himself to anyone who didn't have a reason to know his reasoning. Elena Marlowe had been an anomaly from the first week. She'd come to him through a referral from his corporate attorney, a legitimate firm that handled the surface layer of his business interests. Elena was described as a contract specialist with unusual discretion. Roman had met her in a conference room, expecting nothing, and within 20 minutes had understood that she was the most structurally intelligent person he'd sat across a table from in years. She didn't flinch at the numbers. She didn't ask the questions that would have revealed. She understood exactly what those numbers represented. She simply did the work, found the problems, fixed the problems, constructed legal frameworks with the kind of elegant precision that made Roman's existing lawyers look like they'd been practicing with one hand tied behind their backs. He'd moved her deeper into the operation gradually, not all at once. He wasn't careless. But within 6 months, Elena knew more about the actual architecture of the Vale family enterprise than most of his lieutenants. She knew it because she'd built parts of it: the import documentation, the real estate holding structure, the web of limited liability entities that kept anything Roman actually owned one legal step removed from anything that could be proven. What Roman told himself, and he had to tell himself something, was that the arrangement was strictly professional. She was an asset, a tool, the way a very specialized instrument is a tool. Kept it sharp, you used it precisely, you didn't let it rust. What Roman did not permit himself to examine closely was everything else. The fact that he'd started structuring his schedule around her presence. That when she walked into a room and sat down across from him, something in his chest did a thing he'd stopped being able to name around month 4. That he'd memorized, entirely without meaning to, the slight furrow she got between her brows when she found a legal inconsistency, the look of someone who'd just found a thread and was deciding whether to pull it. He didn't examine it. He was Roman Vale. He didn't examine things that didn't serve a purpose. What he said to Dante that night in the nightclub was the answer that served the purpose in the room. Dante was ambitious. Dante was also, Roman had begun to suspect in recent months, measuring the distances between himself and the people around Roman, calculating what each person's removal would mean for Dante's own position. When Dante asked about Elena with that particular tone, Roman heard what was underneath it. Does she have leverage? Is she a vulnerability? The fastest way to protect Elena was to make her seem worthless. So that's what Roman did. He did not think in the moment about whether she was anywhere nearby. He did not think about what it would mean for her to hear those words. He thought about the strategic outcome, executed it, and moved on. It was Roman Vale's greatest talent and his most catastrophic flaw. He didn't notice the envelope on his desk until late the following afternoon. He'd had 3 meetings in the morning, a call with his accountant in the early afternoon, and a brief and unpleasant conversation with his uncle Victor Sorin about a logistics contract that Roman wasn't planning to approve. When he finally came back to his private office on the building's upper level separate from the club, accessed by a private elevator, it was almost 4 o'clock. The envelope was sitting dead center on his desk, nothing written on the outside, not sealed. He stood looking at it for a moment before he picked it up. Inside were 2 things. A piece of Elena's stationery, he recognized it. She used a specific cream-colored paper, always the same, and a slim white object that it took him a beat to recognize. He read the note first. Roman, I am resigning effective immediately. I will not be available for follow-up questions or transition work. All files have been organized and labeled in the usual system. Please do not contact me, Elena. 6 sentences. No drama. No accusation. He set the note down and looked at the pregnancy test. It took him longer than it should have to understand what he was looking at. Not because he was slow, because his brain was doing the thing brains do when a fact arrives that is too large to fit through the usual channels. It tried to reroute, to find another interpretation. Locate some alternative explanation. There wasn't one. 2 lines. He sat down. He sat in his chair in his office on a Friday afternoon in late October, and he stared at the 2-line pregnancy test on his desk. And for the first time, in as long as he could remember, Roman Vale did not know what to do. Picked up his phone and called her number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He texted Elena. Call me. He waited 5 minutes and called a 3rd time. The number had been disconnected. Roman set his phone on the desk very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands aren't quite steady and you don't want anyone to notice. He looked at the test again. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the street below, where the rain from the previous night had left the gutters still running, and the sky was the particular flat gray of a city that wasn't done with you yet. He stood there for a while. Then he called Marco, his head of security. I need you to find someone, he said. What Marco came back with 2 hours later was not good. Elena Marlowe, age 31, had vacated her apartment as of that morning. The lease had been under her name. Month to month, Marco found out from the building super that she'd paid out her remaining balance in cash 3 weeks ago, which meant she'd been planning this. Her car was gone from the parking structure. Her phone number, as Roman had already discovered, was no longer active. The number was a prepaid line she'd apparently been using for the past 2 months as a secondary contact, the kind of thing you set up when you're preparing to disappear. She's been planning this, Marco said, standing in Roman's office with his hands clasped in front of him like a man delivering news he'd rather not be delivering. At least a few weeks, maybe longer. Her family? Roman asked. Sister in Milwaukee. Parents are in Florida, retired. We've got eyes on the sister's place. Don't approach them, Roman said immediately. Don't contact them. Don't let them know we're watching. Marco looked at him carefully. Okay, do you want to tell me what's going on? Roman looked at the desk. The envelope had been moved to the side, but the test was still there. He hadn't put it away. He wasn't sure why. Just find her, he said. Quietly. Nobody else knows we're looking. Dante's going to notice. Nobody else knows, Roman repeated. Marco nodded and left. Roman sat back down at his desk and thought about the timeline. 3 weeks ago, Elena had started setting up a prepaid phone. She'd paid out her lease. She'd been building an exit quietly, methodically, the same way she built everything with precision and no wasted motion. He tried to calculate when she would have known about the pregnancy. 6 weeks ago? 8? Long enough that she'd made her decision well before last night. Last night had simply been the moment she stopped waiting for a reason to stay. He had given her every reason to go. The thought sat in his stomach like something cold. He didn't sleep Thursday night or Friday night. Saturday morning he was in the office before 6, which was unusual even for him, and he was going through the call logs on Elena's work phone, the one she'd returned, sitting in a separate envelope on his desk that he hadn't opened until Marco mentioned it. The work phone had been wiped professionally, the kind of clean wipe that left no recoverable data. She'd known how to do that because she'd arranged the security protocols on their systems. She'd helped build the cage she'd just walked out of. He found himself sitting with her work phone in his hand, staring at the blank screen, and the thought that came to him unwanted. Clear as anything was this, she was always smarter than the room. He'd known that. He'd valued it. He'd used it. And somewhere along the line, he'd started treating her like a fixed asset on a balance sheet, something that would simply continue to exist because it always had. He understood now, sitting in the gray Saturday morning light, that Elena had never been a fixed asset. She'd been a person making a choice every single day to stay, to do this work, to remain inside an orbit that asked everything of her and gave her very little in return, except proximity to a man who apparently found it convenient to describe her as meaningless. Thought about the note. Please do not contact me. He thought about the 2 lines on the test. He thought about the fact that right now, somewhere in this city or outside it, Elena was alone with a secret that was half his, and she had specifically, deliberately, chose not to give him the chance to respond to it before she disappeared. She wasn't running from danger, he realized. She was running from him. Victor Sorin called on Saturday afternoon, which was not unusual. Victor called regularly, and the calls were almost always about money, specifically about the allocations of various enterprise interests that Victor believed should be flowing more generously in his direction. Roman's uncle was 61 years old, and he had been his father's younger brother and most consistent headache, a man who had the instincts of someone who should have led, but the character of someone who couldn't be trusted with anything larger than a mid-level logistics contract. Roman took the call standing at his window, half listening, making appropriate noises at appropriate intervals. Victor was talking about the port contract, something Roman had already mentally filed under problems for next month. Then Victor said, casually, the way you say something when you want it to land, without appearing like you aimed it, I heard the Marlowe woman resigned. Roman went very still. Word travels? Victor continued, his voice carrying that particular quality smooth, avuncular, slightly pleased. You know how people talk. I was just wondering if everything was squared away on the legal side. Those contracts she handled, I assume she left things in good order? Everything's fine, Roman said. Good? A pause. She was with us a long time. Almost 2 years? Victor, Roman said. Was there something specific you needed? A beat. No, just checking in. You know me. Roman said goodbye and hung up. He stood with the phone in his hand for a long time afterward. Victor knew Elena had resigned. Victor knew her name, her tenure, and had called to gauge Roman's reaction within 24 hours of her leaving. There were exactly 2 ways Victor could have found out that fast either someone in the building had talked, or Victor had a source closer to Roman's operation than Roman had accounted for. Either way, the call meant one thing. Elena's disappearance was already visible to people. Roman hadn't intended to have that information. And if Victor was asking about the contracts she'd handled, Roman thought about what Elena knew, the scope of it, the architecture of the whole enterprise laid out in her meticulous files, paper trails that, in the wrong hands or the wrong context, could be devastating. He'd thought this was about a pregnancy. He was beginning to understand it might be about something considerably more dangerous. Marco's team found a lead on Monday. A woman matching Elena's description had purchased a train ticket cash, no ID required for that route out of Union Station on Friday morning, the day after she'd left the envelope. The ticket was to a mid-sized town in Wisconsin, about 3.5 hours north. They found the purchase by working backward through station cameras, which took the weekend to get access to. She's good, Marco said, and Roman could hear the involuntary note of respect in his voice. She didn't use credit cards, didn't use her name. Traveled early before the morning rush. The station camera caught her face going through the gate. She had 1 bag. Roman looked at the still frame Marco pulled up on his tablet. Elena in a gray coat he'd never seen before, a single rolling suitcase, her hair tucked under a knit hat. She looked calm. She was looking straight ahead, not toward the cameras. She wasn't hiding. Exactly, she was simply moving with purpose, the way someone moves when they've already decided, and the deciding is done. Find out where in Wisconsin, Roman said. We're working it. She could have transferred, find out. He handed the tablet back. Marco hesitated at the door. Roman, whatever's going on if she left on her own, and we go get her. I'm not going to drag her anywhere, Roman said. His voice came out quieter than he intended, which surprised him. I just need to know she's safe. Marco looked at him for a moment, with an expression Roman couldn't entirely decode. Then he nodded and left. Roman turned back to the window. Safe. He needed to know she was safe. The word felt strange in his mouth, applied to this situation, applied to himself as the speaker. Since when did Roman Vale lose sleep over whether someone was safe? Since when did Roman Vale spend 3 days in a state of suspended dread, unable to think clearly, unable to eat a full meal, replaying a single 4-word sentence in his head on a loop? She means nothing to me. He'd said it without thinking. He'd said it because it was tactically useful, and Dante needed to hear it, and Roman's mind had been doing the 1,000 calculations it always did in that room, And she'd been a background assumption, part of the landscape. He'd known she was there, the way you know a wall is there. You don't think about it. You count on it. You'd only notice if it were gone. She was gone. And Roman Vale was discovering slowly, brick by brick, that she hadn't been a wall at all. She'd been something structural, something load-bearing. And without her, the whole interior of his life felt like it was producing a sound he'd never heard before, a low, terrible settling, the sound of weight redistributing itself over empty space. It was Dante who told him about Victor, not intentionally. Dante came to him Tuesday morning with a contract question, and somewhere in the middle of the conversation he mentioned, dropped in, the way you drop something to see if it lands, that he'd heard Victor had been making calls. To the Eastern board members, to the port managers, two of the lawyers who handled the family's more sensitive proceedings. What kind of calls? Roman asked. Dante shrugged with practiced carelessness. Just touching base from what I heard. Nothing specific. Roman watched Dante's face. He'd gotten very good at reading Donna's face, because Dante's face was the kind of face that almost told the truth. It got close enough that you could be fooled if you weren't paying attention, but there was always this micro delay, this tiny fraction of a second, where the expression was chosen rather than felt. Why are you telling me this? Roman said. Because I work for you, Dante said. And I think you should know what your uncle's doing while you're a pause that was not quite long enough to be rude while you've got other things on your mind. Roman studied him. What do you think I have on my mind, Dante? Dante smiled with just his mouth. I think the Marlowe situation is more complicated than you let on. I think she didn't just resign, and I think Victor's been paying attention to the timing. It was the most honest thing Dante had said to him in months, which was itself a warning sign. When Dante dropped the performance and told you something straight, it was because he'd calculated that the straight version served him better than the crooked one. Thank you, Roman said. I'll handle it. After Dante left, Roman sat at his desk for a long time. Victor had a source. Victor was making calls while Roman was distracted. And whatever Victor thought he knew about Elena, about the pregnancy, about what she carried, about what the existence of Roman's heir would mean, for the family's succession, Victor was already moving on it. Roman picked up his phone. He called Marco. Drop everything else, he said. Find Elena today. Marco found her Wednesday. A small lakeside town in northern Wisconsin, 2 hours from the train station she'd arrived at. She was renting a room from a woman who ran a quiet bed and breakfast off the main road, paid in cash, 1 week at a time, given a name that wasn't hers but wasn't so far from her real name that she couldn't respond to it naturally. She'd been there 5 days. Roman drove himself. He didn't take Marco, didn't take security, didn't call ahead. He left Chicago at 4 a.m, drove through the flat dark of the interstate, and arrived at the bed and breakfast just after 7, as the light was coming up cold and thin over the lake. He knocked on the door of the main house and spoke briefly to the woman who answered, middle-aged, suspicious, a woman who looked at Roman and clearly found him out of place in her quiet establishment. He didn't push. He said Elena's name and that he was someone she knew, and he asked if she'd pass a message. The message was simple. I'm outside, I'm alone. I'm not here to bring you back. He went back to his car and waited. 22 minutes later, the side door of the bed and breakfast opened. Elena came out. She was wearing a heavy wool sweater and dark pants, her hair down, her face bare. She looked different from the last time he'd seen her, and he understood suddenly that what was different was that she looked like herself. Like a version of herself she'd never shown inside Vault, inside any of the rooms they'd shared. She looked tired and a little thin and completely steady. She stopped about 10 feet from his car and looked at him. He got out. They stood there in the cold morning light, beside a lake he didn't know the name of, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Elena folded her arms across her chest, not defensively. He thought, just against the cold, and she said, "How did you find me?" "Marco," he said. "Cameras at Union Station." She nodded slowly, like she was filing that away. "Are you safe?" he said. "Are you okay?" Something shifted in her expression. "That's an interesting question from you, Elena." "What do you want, Roman?" He'd rehearsed this, or tried to. Spent 6 hours in a car, turning over every version of this conversation, and none of them had felt right, because in every version he was asking for something, and she was in a position to say no, and Roman Vale was not a man who placed himself in positions like that. He controlled the terms. He set the stage. He'd built an entire criminal empire on the principle that you never asked for anything you weren't already certain of getting. He stood in the cold Wisconsin morning outside a lakeside bed and breakfast, and he said, "I found out about the pregnancy." "I know you did," she said. "I left it there. Why didn't you tell me before?" "I needed to make a decision first." "And the decision was to disappear?" "The decision," Elena said, her voice even and clear, "was to stop organizing my life around a man who told his lieutenant that I mean nothing to him." Roman said nothing. The lake behind the bed and breakfast was gray in the morning light. A bird called somewhere in the trees. The cold had a particular quality up here, away from the city cleaner, more honest, the kind of cold that didn't apologize. "I said that," Roman said. "You did. I said it because Dante was—" "I know why you said it," Elena said. Her voice didn't rise, didn't crack. If anything, it got quieter. "You said it because it was useful. Because it protected the asset, which is what I was to you." An asset. She looked at him directly. "I've known that for a long time, Roman. I just kept telling myself I was wrong." He stood there and took that. There was no good response to the truth when someone laid it out that cleanly. Could have argued, constructed a counter case, as he would in any other context. But this wasn't a negotiation. Elena wasn't waiting for his closing argument. She was simply telling him what was real. "The baby," he said finally, "is mine," she said. "I will raise this child. I will do it without your money or your protection or your name, and I will do it safely, away from your world, and I will make sure that whatever this child grows up knowing about you, it is not the version of you that operates inside that building." The words landed with the particular weight of things that have been thought through completely, all the way to the bottom. "Elena," he said, "Victor knows." Her expression changed. "What?" "He called me Saturday. He mentioned you by name. He knows you resigned. He knows the timing, and he's been making calls to the board members and the legal team. He knows you handled the internal contracts. If he figures out about the pregnancy, he'd use the child," she said. Not a question. Her voice had gone careful in a way he recognized she was already thinking 3 steps ahead, because that was what Elena did. "He'd use you both," Roman said, "to control me, or to remove the possibility of any heir that isn't his." The silence between them was different now, not the silence of grief or anger, but the silence of two people assessing a threat. "So you came here," Elena said slowly, "to warn me." "I came here," Roman said, "because you're carrying my child, and my uncle is already moving, and I'm not going to stand in Chicago and do nothing." She looked at him for a long moment. The bird in the trees called again. The lake shifted. "That's not enough, Roman," she said. "That's not being afraid, for the baby is not the same as this mattering to you. Me mattering to you." He didn't answer right away. And Elena, who had spent 22 months learning his rhythms, saw the thing he couldn't say, caught in his chest, held there by 20 years of learned habits, and the iron certainty that feeling things openly was the kind of mistake that got men like him killed. "Go back to Chicago," she said, not unkindly. "Deal with Victor." And then she stopped. "And then what?" She looked at the lake. "And then figure out who you actually are, under all of it. Because I don't think you know. And I can't love someone who doesn't know." She walked back to the side door. He stood by his car and watched her go. The door closed. He stood there in the cold for a long time after. Then he got in the car. He drove back toward Chicago as the sun came up, fully over the flat interstate, and he thought about what she'd said, "Figure out who you actually are." And the thought that came back to him, quiet and relentless and impossible to argue with, was this: he had spent his entire adult life constructing a version of himself that could not be threatened, could not be moved, could not be reduced. He had said, "She means nothing to me because it was efficient, because it was strategic, because it kept the architecture intact." And Elena had looked at that architecture, walked to the door and closed it behind her, with 6 calm sentences and a pregnancy test on his desk. She hadn't been destroyed by what he said. She'd simply left. And Roman Vale drove south through the gray morning, understanding, for the first time, that the most dangerous person in his life wasn't Dante or Victor or any enemy he'd ever made. It was Elena Marlowe, because she was the only person who had ever seen exactly what he was and chosen for a while to stay anyway. And now she had chosen to go. And the question of whether she would ever choose to come back, that question lived in his chest the rest of that drive, like something with teeth, like something alive, like the most frightening thing he had ever been unable to control. This is a work of complete cinematic fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely invented. He was back in Chicago by noon. The drive had taken 6 hours total, and Roman had stopped once for gas and coffee he didn't finish. And the whole time the road had been doing that thing flat Midwestern roads do, in late October, just going and going and going, without anything to interrupt the view or give you a reason to stop thinking. He'd arrived back at his building, parked in the private garage, taken the elevator up, and walked into his office to find Dante already sitting in the chair across from his desk. Not standing, sitting, in the chair that faced Roman's desk, with one ankle crossed over his knee, like a man who'd been waiting long enough that he'd gotten comfortable. Roman stopped in the doorway. "You weren't answering your phone," Dante said. "I was driving." "All night and all morning?" Roman walked to his desk and sat down without answering. He set his keys on the surface. He looked at Dante with the particular quality of attention he reserved for moments when he needed to see clearly, not the performance of attention, not the strategic scan, but the actual thing. The full focus. Dante looked back at him with that almost honest face. "What do you need, Dante?" "Victor called a meeting," Dante said, "while you were gone. Last night, he had the Eastern board members, Carver from the Port Authority, and both of the Rice lawyers in a room for 2 hours. Roman felt something move through him that wasn't quite anger. Colder than anger. More precise. "Who told you?" he said. "Carver," Dante said. "He called me this morning. He wanted to know if you knew about it, and I told him I'd find out." A pause. "Roman, Victor's not just making calls anymore. He's convening." "Convening isn't a coup," Roman said. "No," Dante agreed. "But it's the meeting before the coup." He uncrossed his ankle and leaned forward, and for a moment the performance dropped completely, and Roman saw something underneath it that was not loyalty. He wouldn't call it loyalty, but a kind of self-preservation that was aligned, for now, with Roman's own survival. "He's moving fast. Whatever he's planning, he's not waiting for you to get your head straight." Roman looked at the desk, at the spot where the envelope had sat 4 days ago. "What else did Carver say?" "That Victor asked questions about succession," Dante said carefully. "About how the family structure would transfer if there was a change in leadership." The room was very quiet. "A change in leadership," Roman repeated. "That's what Carver said," Victor said. Dante's eyes were steady. "Victor used those words specifically." Roman stood up. He walked to the window, the same window he'd stood at 4 days ago, looking down at the wet street, and he looked out at the city, which was doing what it always did, moving and grinding and not caring about any of this. The sky was flat white. The traffic was thick. "Get me a meeting with Carver," Roman said. "Not at the club. Somewhere neutral." "When today?" He turned from the window. "And Dante, the next time Victor convenes something without my knowledge, I want to know while it's happening. Not after." Dante looked at him with that micro-delay that told Roman he was calculating whether to say the thing or leave it. "That would mean having someone in the room," Dante said. "Yes," Roman said. "It would." Dante nodded slowly. "I'll make some calls." He left. Roman stood at the window for another moment after the door closed. Then he pulled out his phone and looked at it. No messages from a number he didn't recognize. No calls. Elena had a new phone somewhere in northern Wisconsin, a number he didn't have, on a network he couldn't track without resources he wasn't willing to deploy against her. Put the phone away. He had a problem in Chicago that required his full attention, and he had a woman in Wisconsin who had been very clear about what she needed from him, which was space and time, and the absence of Roman Vale from her immediate orbit. The two things sat in him simultaneously, side by side like two rooms in a house with a wall between them that he didn't know how to remove. He made himself focus on the problem he could actually address. Victor. Carver was a heavy-set man in his early 50s, with the hands of someone who'd spent years on loading docks before he'd become useful in a different capacity. He met Roman at a diner in the northwest corner of the city, a place with bad lighting and good coffee and booths with high backs that made it impossible to see who was sitting where from the entrance. Roman arrived first, ordered coffee, and waited. Carver slid into the booth across from him at 3:15 and immediately looked at the table instead of at Roman, which told Roman everything he needed to know about Carver's current state of mind. "You look terrible," Roman said. "Thank you," Carver said. He picked up the laminated menu, even though Roman was certain he wasn't going to order anything. People picked up menus in conversations like this because it gave their hands something to do. Victor called me Sunday night, said he wanted to touch base. Needed some thoughts on the port contract, the one you've been sitting on. "I've been sitting on it, because the terms aren't right," Roman said. "I know that," Carver said. "I told him that," he said. Carver set the menu down and finally looked at Roman. His eyes were the eyes of a man who understood that the ground was shifting and had not yet determined which way to lean. He said the terms could be revised under new management. Roman wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "New management," he said. His words. Carver's jaw was tight. "Roman, I've worked with your family for 14 years. I'm not interested in being in the middle of whatever this is. I called Dante because I wanted you to know, and now you know, and I would very much like to go back to doing my job without." "What else did he say?" Roman said. Carver exhaled through his nose. "He asked if you'd been distracted lately, if your attention had been elsewhere." A pause with a particular weight to it. He said something about a situation that had recently come to his attention. Something personal, he called it. That might affect your judgment going forward. Roman went very still. Something personal, Victor knew. Not just that Elena had left. Victor knew about the pregnancy. The only question was how. Roman had kept the information between himself and Marco. He was certain of Marco, had been certain of Marco for 15 years, which meant either Marco had a leak in his team, or Victor had found out some other way, or Dante. The thought arrived quietly without fanfare. Roman looked at it from several angles. Dante had been the one to ask about Elena in the club the night she'd overheard. Dante was the one who'd come to him Tuesday morning with the information about Victor's calls, information that had seemed helpful, that had seemed like Dante being transparent, but which had also served to communicate to Roman exactly what Victor already knew. Dante had been in his office this morning, sitting comfortably, waiting. Roman thought about the timing of Victor's Sunday meeting. Roman had spent the weekend trying to find Elena. He'd been unreachable, distracted, operating outside his normal patterns. And somehow, within 48 hours of the pregnancy test landing on his desk, Victor Soren had called a meeting and used the phrase "something personal." "Thank you," Roman said to Carver. "What are you going to do?" Roman stood up, put money on the table for the coffee, and said, "My job." He didn't confront Dante directly. That was the thing about people who were almost loyal. You didn't confront them with suspicion, because they'd simply recalibrate. They'd shift the story. They'd perform innocence with enough precision that you'd spend energy doubting yourself instead of them. Roman had watched his father make that mistake twice, and he'd filed it away as one of the lessons he would not repeat. Instead, he spent Wednesday doing something he hadn't done in months. He went through the internal communication logs himself, manually, the old way, looking for pattern disruptions. He had Marco pull a separate set of records call times, routing logs, access timestamps on the file system without telling him why. He told Marco it was a routine security audit. Marco looked at him with the expression of a man who knew it wasn't routine, but who had the good sense not to say so. The logs took most of Wednesday afternoon. Roman sat at his desk, with his door closed and his phone on silent, and he went through them with the methodical attention of someone who had grown up understanding that the devil was always in the detail you almost skipped. He was looking for the moment, the specific point at which information about Elena, about the pregnancy, about her departure, could have flowed out of the small circle of people who knew. He found it at 11:47 on Friday morning. Call from Dante's secondary line, not his primary work number, a line Roman hadn't known Dante had to a number that resolved. After 20 minutes of Marco's tracing work, to a routing exchange that eventually ended at a phone, registered to one of Victor's logistics contacts. 12 minutes after Elena had left her envelope on Roman's desk, Thursday afternoon, Dante had called that number. Roman looked at the timestamp for a long time. 12 minutes. Dante had a source in the building, someone who had seen the envelope, seen Elena leave and reported it. And Dante had immediately called Victor's channel. Before Roman had even found the envelope himself, he sat with this for the rest of Wednesday, and did not move until he was certain what he was looking at. Thursday morning, Roman called a meeting. Not a large one. Just the inner circle, Dante, Marco, and two of the senior operational figures. Men who had been with the family for long enough that their positions were structural rather than political. He met them in the conference room on the building's third floor, the one with no windows to the exterior, and he arrived last and poured himself a glass of water and stood at the head of the table. "I want to talk about the Eastern Board meeting," he said. He watched every face in the room. Dante's expression did the thing he'd learned to look for: not a flinch, not a tell, but a very slight consolidation, a pulling in, the way a poker player's body adjusts when the river card is turned. "I've been made aware that Victor held a meeting without my authorization," Roman continued. "That meeting included personnel who operate within the structure of this organization. I want to be clear about what that means." He looked around the table slowly. "It means someone's in my circle communicated information about internal developments to my uncle before I'd decided what to communicate. Someone's decided that Victor's access to that information served their interests better than mine." The room was quiet. Dante said, "You think someone at this table?" "I know," Roman said. The word landed flat. No accusation in it. No performance. Just the fact. Dante's face went through three things in about a second and a half: surprise, calculation, and then a smooth, practiced reversion to a neutral expression that was almost perfect. "Almost. Roman," he said, "if you have evidence of something." "I'm not interested in a conversation about evidence, Dante." Roman set his water glass down. "I'm interested in whether anyone in this room wants to tell me something before I tell them what I already know." Silence. The two senior figures looked at the table. Marco looked at Roman. Dante looked at Roman with the particular focus of a man deciding how to play the hand he'd been dealt. Then Dante said, "Victor approached me 6 weeks ago. He said he was worried about the direction of the organization and wanted to stay informed. He said it was a loyalty issue, that he was loyal to the family, not just to you specifically." Roman listened. "I didn't pass him anything sensitive," Dante said. "I told him things he would have found out anyway. I didn't tell him about the Marlowe situation. He asked me directly on Thursday night, and I said I didn't know the details." "But you confirmed she'd left," Roman said. A pause. "I confirmed she'd resigned, yes. And the pregnancy?" Dante's face went careful in a way that answered the question before his mouth did. "I didn't tell him directly," Dante said, "but he may have inferred." "You gave him enough to infer," Roman said. Dante said nothing. Roman looked at him for a long moment. Not with anger, the anger was there, but beneath it, and it would keep. What was on the surface was something quieter and more absolute, a conclusion, a door closing. "Thank you for telling me," Roman said. "We'll talk later." He ended the meeting. On the way out, Marco fell into step beside him and said very quietly, "What do you want to do about Dante?" "Nothing yet," Roman said. He's more useful inside than outside," Roman said. "And I want to see who else Victor's been talking to." Marco was quiet for a moment. "And Elena?" Roman slowed his pace but didn't stop. "She needs more time," he said. "Victor knows she's pregnant. If he finds her." "I know," Roman said. "I've got 2 of our people in the town. Watching only. She doesn't know they're there. The moment anything changes, I need to know immediately." Marco nodded. They reached the elevator and Marco stepped in. Roman didn't. He stood in the hallway for a moment, thinking about a woman in a wool sweater beside a lake who had told him to figure out who he actually was. He was starting to think the answer was going to require burning something down first. Victor Soren's office was in a building on the south side that the family used for its more legitimate holding interests: import-export documentation, shipping manifests, the surface layer that faced the world and invited no questions. Roman went there Thursday afternoon unannounced, which was the point. He walked past the assistant without stopping, opened Victor's office door, and closed it behind him. Victor was at his desk, and the expression that crossed his face when he looked up lasted less than a second before the performance snapped back into place: the warm, avuncular, faintly surprised expression of a man who was always pleased to see his nephew. "Roman," he said, starting to rise. "Sit down," Roman said. Victor sat down. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and now carried its age with deliberate dignity. He wore good suits and kept his office very clean. And Roman had understood for most of his adult life that this cleanliness was a form of performance, the visual presentation of a man who was orderly, reasonable, and trustworthy, which was precisely what Victor Soren was not. You held a meeting, Roman said. He didn't sit. He stood in front of the desk, which was intentional. He needed Victor looking up, not across, Sunday night. The Eastern Board, Carver, the Rice lawyers, without telling me. Victor's hands, which had been folded on the desk, opened slightly. Conversation, he said. Not a meeting, informal. You've been. He paused with calculated delicacy preoccupied, and I wanted to make sure certain relationships weren't being neglected. And the succession questions? A beat. Who told you that? Victor said. And then, because he was good, he shifted immediately, Carver. I should have known. He's never had the stomach for. Victor, Roman said. Stop. Victor stopped. The room was quiet. Outside, the distant sound of the city. Inside, the specific silence of two men who had been circling each other for years and had finally arrived at the center. What do you know about Elena Marlowe? Roman said. Victor's expression settled into something careful, something stripped of the avuncular warmth. I know she handled a great deal of sensitive work for this organization. I know she left abruptly, and I know his eyes held Roman steadily that there are people in this organization who are wondering whether that departure was managed properly, whether she was handled correctly. Handled, Roman said. The word was dangerous in his mouth. Protected, Victor said smoothly. In the sense that we can't have someone with that much institutional knowledge simply walk out the door into a city full of federal investigators and journalists and... Elena is not a security risk, Roman said. The steadiness in his own voice surprised him. She is a private individual who is no longer employed by this organization, and she is entirely outside this conversation. Victor looked at him with something that might have been, under other circumstances, pity. She's carrying your child, Roman, Victor said quietly. The room didn't change. The sound from outside didn't change. Roman's breathing didn't change, but something happened behind his eyes that Victor apparently saw, because his uncle's expression shifted, became slightly more satisfied. The way a chess player's face shifts when a gambit has been confirmed. I'm not here to cause problems, Victor said, with the tone of a man who was here to cause precisely that. I'm family. I'm concerned about the organization's future. An heir changes everything, you must know that. The board members have thoughts about what an heir means for succession, for structure, for... The child, Roman said carefully, is not your concern. The child is the family's concern, Victor said. The moment that pregnancy became real, it became a matter of succession. You know how this works. Your father structured it that way, specifically. Any heir of direct blood. My father's structure, Roman said, is something I'm reconsidering. Victor went still. It was the first time in the conversation that Roman had seen his uncle actually go still, not the performance of stillness, not the calculated pause, but the real thing. The involuntary arrest of motion that happens when someone says something you weren't prepared for. What does that mean? Victor said. It means the structure isn't fixed, Roman said. And it means that whatever you're planning with the Eastern Board and Carver and the lawyers needs to stop. Today, Victor studied him with an expression that was moving, slowly, from surprise toward something colder. You're protecting her, he said. That's what this is. You've gotten... He seemed to search for the word attached. I'm protecting what's mine, Roman said. And then, hearing the word in his own mouth, he corrected himself not for Victor, but because it was true, I'm protecting her. And the baby. Those are separate things. They're not separate things, Victor said. That's what you don't understand yet. The moment she has that child, she is part of the equation permanently. She has information, she has leverage, she has a claim. And if you don't manage that, if I don't manage her, Roman said. Victor spread his hands. I'm using your language. You've always been practical. I'm being practical now, Roman said. Back off. All of it. The meetings, the calls, the questions about succession. I'm telling you once. Victor looked at him for a long moment. The warmth was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was the thing Roman had always known was there, the hunger. Patient, durable, and very, very old. All right, Victor said. We'll table it. Roman turned and walked out. He did not believe, for 1 second, that Victor would table anything. Friday was the day Elena called. He didn't recognize the number new prepaid, She'd been smart enough to use a different provider, but he answered in the second ring because he answered every unknown number now, had been doing it for 2 weeks. "It's me," she said. He was standing in his office, and he sat down very quickly without meaning to. "Elena, I'm not calling to change anything," she said immediately. "I need you to know that. I'm not coming back. A pause with a particular texture to it, something ragged at the edges. Someone came to the front of the bed and breakfast today. A man. He asked Margaret, that's the woman who owns the place. He asked if she had any guests staying for an extended period. Describe me." Roman's hand tightened on the phone. "What did he look like? I didn't see him directly." Margaret told me. She said he was big, well-dressed. Asked questions like he already knew some of the answers. Another pause. "It wasn't your people, was it?" It wasn't a question. Roman looked at his desk, at the city outside the window, at his own reflection in the glass, which was a man who was very tired and who was beginning to understand the full dimensions of the problem he'd created by saying 4 words in a nightclub 2 weeks ago. "No," he said. "It wasn't my people." "Silence, you need to move," he said. "Today. Don't stay there tonight." "I know that," she said. And her voice had the particular quality of someone who has already thought it through. "I just needed to know if you sent him." "I didn't," Roman said. "Elena, I have 2 of my people there, close by, watching only." "I should have told you. I should have asked." He stopped. "I'm sorry, I should have asked." The silence after that was a different kind of silence. Not comfortable, but not hostile. The silence of 2 people adjusting to something. "Where are you sending me?" she said finally. "Somewhere he doesn't have contacts," Roman said. "I need to make some calls. Can you be packed in an hour?" "I've been packed since I got here," she said. Of course she had. He'd been ridiculous to even ask. "One of my people will come to the door," he said. "His name is Anton. He'll say the lake is cold this time of year." The phrase, "Don't open the door for anyone else." Roman. Yeah, another pause. "When this is over, whatever this is, I need you to understand that the baby changes what I need from you, but it doesn't change what I said at the lake. About figuring out who you are. I know that," he said. "I need you to actually know it," she said. "Not just say it." "Elena," he said. And then he said the thing that came out before he could construct it, the unbuilt thing, the version of himself that existed below the architecture. "I know it because you're the first person who ever thought there was something worth finding." The phone was quiet for so long that he thought she'd hung up. Then she said very quietly, "Call Anton." She hung up. Roman sat with the phone in his hand in the silence of his office on a Friday afternoon, and he understood with perfect clarity that he was standing at the edge of something, that the next hours and days and whatever came after were going to require him to make choices that couldn't be unmade. He could feel it the way you feel weather coming, not the storm yet, just the change in the air, the particular stillness before everything moves. He called Marco, he called Anton. He sat at his desk until almost midnight, working through call logs and financial records with the focused, angry efficiency of a man who is eliminating everything extraneous because the most important thing is now the only thing, and he pieced together, record by record, the full shape of what Victor had been building. Not a takeover. Not exactly. A pressure campaign. Victor didn't want to run the organization outright. Victor knew he didn't have the operational credibility for that. What Victor wanted was Roman compromised. Roman distracted and emotionally exposed, and making decisions from a place of vulnerability, which would require Victor's steadying hand, Victor's guidance, Victor's presence at the table where the real decisions got made. Pregnancy was the lever. Elena was the lever. A man trying to protect his pregnant ex-lover while managing a criminal organization, while containing an internal political crisis, was a man who could be managed. Victor had mapped it all out, and he'd done it with Dante's help. Roman stared at the financial records at midnight and made a decision that felt less like a decision and more like a door swinging open that had always been there, waiting. Picked up his phone. He called a number he'd had for years and never used a number belonging to a federal prosecutor named Geiger, with whom Roman had maintained a careful arm's length, completely off the record channel that had occasionally proven useful to both of them in ways that neither acknowledged publicly. Geiger answered on the third ring. "This is unexpected," Geiger said. "I have something for you," Roman said. "It's significant. I need to discuss terms first." A pause. "What kind of terms?" Roman looked at the records on his desk. At the architecture of a criminal enterprise he'd spent 15 years maintaining and refining and protecting with everything he had. He thought about a woman in a wool sweater by a gray lake, asking him to figure out who he was. Kind Roman said, "That start with complete immunity for a private individual named Elena Marlowe, and end with me handing you a case you won't have to build from scratch." The silence on this other end of the phone lasted exactly 4 seconds. "I'm listening," Geiger said. Roman closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, and then he opened them, picked up a pen and began. "This is a work of complete cinematic fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely invented." Geiger called back at 7:15 Saturday morning. Roman had slept 3 hours on the couch in his office, which was not sleep so much as a suspension of consciousness, the kind of rest a body takes when it has no other option, when the mind finally runs out of material to turn over and simply shuts down for a while out of biological necessity. He woke up with the phone already in his hand before he was fully conscious. The way you wake up when you've been waiting for something. "We can meet," Geiger said. No preamble, no greeting. That was the thing about federal prosecutors, they didn't do warm-up. The usual protocol. "I know the protocol," Roman said. He sat up. His back hurt. He looked at the desk, at the records he'd been working through until 3 in the morning, at the cold coffee in a cup he didn't remember pouring. Outside the window, Chicago was doing its Saturday thing slower than a weekday, not quite relaxed, a city that never fully exhaled. "Roman," Geiger said, "what you said last night, about the scope of what you're bringing. I need you to be clear with me before we sit down. I can't walk into that room and have you pull back." "I'm not pulling back," Roman said. "Because what you described, if it's what I think it is, that's not a small case. That's not a plea bargain situation. That's a restructuring of how we understand the legal exposure of 3 separate federal jurisdictions, and I need to know you're committed before I put resources behind it." "I'm committed," Roman said. A pause. What changed? Roman looked at the window, at the gray Saturday sky, at his own reflection, the same reflection that had looked back at him the night before, and the night before that, gradually becoming someone he didn't entirely recognize, not because he'd changed yet, but because he was in the process of understanding who he actually was, the real accounting, and it was not a comfortable document to read. "Everything," he said. Geiger said noon again and hung up. Roman put the phone down, stood up, stretched his back until something cracked and went to wash his face. He stood at the sink in his private bathroom off the office and looked at himself in the mirror properly, not the window reflection, the actual mirror, the uncompromising kind. He looked like what he was, a man who hadn't slept, who had been running on coffee and adrenaline for 2 weeks, whose eyes had the particular flatness of someone who has made a decision so large that the mind hasn't quite caught up to it yet. He thought about Elena in a new location he didn't know, yet Anton had moved her Friday night, texted him a single confirmation at 11:40, package delivered, secure, and he thought about the fact that he didn't know where she was, by design, which was what she needed, and which was also the most uncomfortable thing he'd experienced in recent memory, this not knowing, this absence of the ability to verify that she was fine. He'd spent 15 years making sure that anything he cared about was within his control. The problem he was currently confronting was that he'd spent 15 years making sure he didn't care about anything he couldn't control, and that system had failed catastrophically somewhere around the time Elena Marlowe had sat across a table from him and found a structural flaw in a contract in under 4 minutes. He dried his face. He put on a clean shirt from the bag he kept in the office closet. He went to meet Geiger. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Geiger brought one other person, a younger woman, early 30s, the kind of focused stillness that meant she was taking mental notes faster than most people took written ones. She didn't introduce herself, and Roman didn't ask. The 3 of them sat in a back room of a commercial space Geiger used for exactly these conversations, a room with no recording equipment that Roman had verified on his first visit 2 years ago and spot-checked twice since. Roman laid it out, all of it. The full architecture of the Vale family enterprise, built over 30 years, refined under Roman's management for 15. the shell company structure, and the import documentation, and the port authority relationships, and the Eastern and the lawyers and the routing of funds through 7 layers of legitimate holding interests. He talked for most of the first hour. Geiger asked clarifying questions in a measured, precise way that told Roman he already understood most of it and was checking Roman's account against his own existing knowledge. At the end of the first hour, Geiger said, "The immunity terms." Elena Marlowe, Roman said, "complete, federal and state. Any exposure she might have incurred through the work she performed, contract structuring, documentation, anything. She gets a full immunity agreement, signed and filed before I hand over the records." "That's not how this works," Geiger's colleague said. First thing she'd said. Her voice was flat and professional. "We don't sign immunity agreements for individuals we haven't independently assessed." "Then assess her," Roman said. "You'll find she handled legal work she understood was unusual, but never had direct knowledge of criminal operations. She's not a target. She's a witness at worst, and not even that if you're using the records I'm giving you." Geiger looked at his colleague. Something passed between them that Roman couldn't fully read. "We'll need to talk to her," Geiger said. "That's her choice," Roman said. "I can facilitate an introduction. I can't compel her." "Can you get her on the phone today?" Roman thought about Elena's new number, which he had and which she'd given him with the specific caveat that he use it only for emergencies. He thought about what she'd said on the call Anton, and the particular quality of her voice when she said it, stripped of everything except the practical core. "Give me until 3 o'clock, he said. Called her from outside the building, standing on a side street, his coat collar up against the November cold. She answered on the second ring. "Something's happened?" she said immediately. "Nothing's happened to you," he said. "You're safe." "Anton's still there?" "Down the hall," she said. "What is it?" Told her. All of it. The call to Geiger, the meeting, the terms he'd laid out. He told her without editorializing, without trying to shape how she heard it, just the facts in sequence. He owed her that. When he finished, there was a long pause. "You're burning it down," she said. "Yes. All of it." "Yes." Another pause. The line had the faint texture of distance. She was far enough away that he could hear it, the slight attenuation of the connection, which made the silence feel larger. "You know, once this starts, you can't undo it," she said. "I know. Victor's going to know immediately. Dante will know. Every person whose name is in those records." "I know," he said again. "Roman." Her voice had changed. Not softer. Elena's voice didn't soften in moments like this. It went more precise the way it went, when she was working through something important. "What happens to you? In the agreement. What are your terms?" "I haven't negotiated my own terms yet," he said. A beat of silence with a particular texture. "Why not?" she said. He didn't answer right away. "Roman," she said very quietly. "Are you doing this because it's right, or because you're trying to prove something to me?" He stood on the side street in the cold and thought about that question with the full, honest attention it deserved. He thought about Elena by the lake, saying, "Figure out who you are." He thought about sitting at his desk at midnight, looking at records that represented 15 years of choices he hadn't fully examined. He thought about a 2-line pregnancy test on a desk. "Both," he said. "I think both." She was quiet. "Then negotiate your own terms first," she said. "Whatever this is, don't do it as a sacrifice. That's not who I'm asking you to be." Stood there. "Will you talk to Geiger?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Set it up," she hung up. Roman stood on the street for a moment longer. Cab went by. Someone walked a dog. The city moved around him the way it always did, indifferent and continuous. He went back inside and told Geiger 3 o'clock. What happened at 2:47 was the thing Roman had not anticipated. His phone lit up with Marco's name, and the call connected before Roman had fully raised it to his ear. And the first thing Marco said was, "Anton's down." The world stopped making the ambient sounds it had been making. "What?" Roman said. "Anton's down." Marco's voice had the particular compression of someone relaying information they're still processing while they relay it. "He was hit in the parking structure adjacent to wherever she's staying. I don't have the exact address. He didn't give it to me. For obvious reasons, they found him 20 minutes ago. He's alive. He's unconscious, but he's alive." Roman was already moving, out the door, down the hall, toward the exit of the building. "Elena," he said. "We don't know," Marco said. "We can't reach her." The room she was in is empty. Her bag is gone. Roman pushed through the exterior door into the cold. How did they find her? He said. Marco was quiet for exactly 1 second too long. Marco, Roman said. The word came out very flat. The new location, Marco said. Anton's the only one who knew it except another pause. Roman. The only other person who had the address was you. Roman stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building, where he'd just spent 2 hours and 40 minutes talking to a federal prosecutor, and he understood what Marco was telling him, and he went through the logical chain of it in the space of about 4 seconds. Anton had the address. Roman had the address. No one else had the address because Roman had been careful, the most careful he'd ever been, precise because he understood what was at stake. Except he'd called Elena from a phone, his phone. A phone that had been in this building for the past 3 hours. A building that Geiger's office would have surveillance on as a matter of routine practice. A federal prosecutor who had asked, in the first 30 minutes of the meeting, very precise questions about Elena's role, her specific knowledge, the documents she had access to, whether she retained any physical copies of the materials she'd worked on. Questions that Roman now understood were not only about immunity. Get me everything on Geiger, Roman said. His voice was absolutely flat. Now, today. Everything cases, associates, financials, anything that isn't clean. Move, Roman. What? Victor's been working both sides, Roman said. Get me proof. He hung up and stood on the sidewalk, and for about 8 seconds, he simply breathed, in and out, feeling the cold air enter his lungs and exit, grounding himself in the physical fact of the moment. Because if he didn't do that, the thing rising in his chest, the panic, the fury, the nauseating possibility that he had been played from every direction simultaneously would overtake him, and he could not afford to be overtaken. He had called Elena from outside this building. The call had gone through a cell network. His phone was, he pulled it out and looked at it. Standard device, secure as he made it, but if someone had inserted monitoring software at the carrier level, or if there was. He thought about Geiger's assistant, the quiet woman with the precise measuring eyes, who hadn't introduced herself and whose presence he'd accepted without verification because he'd trusted the channel. He'd trusted a channel he'd established with Geiger and maintained at arm's length, and he'd walked into that channel with the most sensitive information he'd ever carried, and he'd assumed the room was clean because he'd checked it twice. 2 years ago. He'd last checked that room 2 years ago. Roman put his phone in his pocket and started walking. Marco had a location on Anton within the hour, a hospital on the city's west side, under a cover name, the attending physician, a woman, who did quiet work for the family's medical needs. Roman went. He sat in the hallway outside the room for a moment, collecting himself, and then he went in. Anton was conscious by the time Roman arrived, though the left side of his face had a bruise spreading from cheekbone to jaw, and his eyes were tracking slightly slow concussion. The physician had said, no permanent damage. He was sitting up in the bed with the careful movements of someone whose head hurt badly enough that they'd learned not to move quickly. He looked at Roman when Roman came in, and the first thing he said was, they knew. I know, Roman said. He pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat. 2 men, professional. Anton's voice was hoarse. They weren't there for me. They came around the back of the structure. I heard them before I saw them, which is the only reason I can tell you this. They had the room number. They went straight to it. He paused, swallowed carefully. She wasn't there. Roman went still. What? She wasn't in the room, Anton said. I don't know how, but I think she made them before they got to me. The room was cleared. Her bag was gone. She was gone. He looked at Roman with the steady eyes of a man who had been doing dangerous work for a long time. She ran Roman on her own, before they got there. Roman sat with this for a moment. Elena had run again. On her own, with no warning, because she'd seen something or sensed something and trusted her instincts and moved before the threat materialized. She'd been doing it since the night she'd left the envelope building contingencies, maintaining readiness, thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone who was looking for her. He felt simultaneously a relief so acute it was almost physical, and a terror that hit directly behind it, because she was gone, and he didn't know where. And this time she didn't have Anton's protection. And Victor's people were active and operational, and clearly had access to information that should have been impossible. Rest, Roman told Anton. He stood up and walked out. He called a number he'd been saving in his head rather than his phone, a contact he'd established 18 months ago, specifically as a dead drop, someone entirely outside the organization's structure, a woman named Hale who operated in the private security sector and who had no connection to the Vale family that anyone could trace. "I need a location search," he said when she answered. "No electronic methods. Boots on ground, city and suburbs starting today." "Who?" "I'll send you a photo and a description," he said. "She's smart. She won't use her name or her cards. Look for cash-paid accommodations, walk-in clinic visits, anything that fits a woman traveling alone who's pregnant and scared." "Timeline? Yesterday," he said. He hung up. The proof Marco found was ugly. Not in the way Roman had expected, not a clean payment trail, not an obvious line connecting Geiger to Victor. What Marco found, working through the Saturday afternoon with two of his best people, was something worse. Something older. Geiger had a file on Elena. A real file, built over 14 months, containing her financial records, her employment history, documentation of her work for the Vale family going back to the first month. The file had been assembled by a private investigative firm, a firm that, when Marco traced the billing records, resolved to a holding company that was 3 layers removed from Victor Soren's personal investment portfolio. Victor had been building a dossier on Elena for over a year. Not on Roman. On Elena specifically. Roman sat across from Marco at a table, in a safe house on the north side, and looked at the records and understood what he was seeing. And the understanding arrived with a clarity that was almost like cold water, shocking, immediate, undeniable. Victor hadn't learned about the pregnancy 2 weeks ago. Victor had known Elena was significant to Roman for over a year. Victor had been watching her, documenting her, building leverage before Roman even fully understood that she was leverage to build. He'd been ahead of the situation the entire time. He'd maneuvered Dante into the position of information source. He'd established a back channel to Geiger. He'd been constructing this from multiple directions simultaneously, waiting for the moment Roman was exposed enough that the structure would work. The moment had been Elena leaving the envelope. It had given Victor exactly the window he needed. "There's more," Marco said. His voice had a quality Roman hadn't heard in it before. Not reluctance exactly. More like the voice of someone who has to say a thing and genuinely wishes they didn't. Roman looked at him. Marco put a second set of documents on the table. "Private investigator Victor hired," he said. "They didn't just surveil Elena. They approached someone in her life." He paused. "Her sister. In Milwaukee." Roman looked at the documents. The investigator had met with Elena's sister Clara 7 weeks ago. The meeting had been framed as an insurance inquiry, a standard pretext. The investigator had asked questions about Elena's health, her state of mind, whether she was under stress. Standard questions that seemed innocuous and weren't. What Clara had told the investigator, not knowing what she was telling, was that Elena had called her 6 weeks ago sounding scared. That Elena had mentioned being involved in work that was making her uncomfortable. That she'd mentioned, in a careful, oblique way that Clara had apparently not fully understood, that she was in a situation she was trying to find a way out of. Clara had also told the investigator the name of Elena's OBGYN. Victor's people had confirmed the pregnancy through Elena's doctor's office 7 weeks ago. They'd been working with that information for nearly 2 months, which meant Victor's entire strategic campaign, the Eastern board meetings, Dante, Geiger, all of it had been built on the foundation of knowing about the baby before Roman knew. Before Elena had even put the test on his desk, Roman sat very still with this information. He sat with it the way you sit with something that recontextualizes everything that came before it, the kind of revelation that doesn't add a new piece to the picture, but reveals that the frame you were using was wrong. That the picture you thought you were looking at was a different picture entirely. Victor hadn't reacted to the pregnancy. He'd been positioned for it. He'd been waiting for Roman to find out, because Victor understood Roman better than Roman had given him credit for. Understood that Roman's exposure point was the thing he wouldn't admit mattered. And he'd built the entire campaign around the moment that exposure became undeniable. "He's had 7 weeks, Roman said. "Yes," Marco said. "He knew before I did." "Yes," Roman looked at the table. The documents. At 14 months of surveillance on Elena Marlowe, laid out in orderly pages by a private investigator who'd been paid through 3 shell companies to a man Roman had been underestimating his entire adult life. "Where's Victor right now?" Roman said. "His apartment on the Gold Coast," Marco said. "He came home about an hour ago. He's been there since." "Alone?" "2 men with him, his usual security," Roman nodded. He stood up. "Roman," Marco said, "if you go there right now." "I'm not going there," Roman said. Marco looked at him. "He's expecting me to react," Roman said. "He's been engineering this entire situation to produce a specific reaction me, moving on emotion, making mistakes, giving him something he can use." He looked at Marco. "So I'm not reacting. What I'm doing is finding Elena. And then?" Roman put on his coat. "And then I'm going to give Victor exactly what he's been preparing for," he said. "Just not in the order he expects it." He was almost at the door when his phone rang. The number was Elena's new prepaid, he answered. "Elena, where are?" "It's not Elena." The voice was male, smooth, carrying a particular quality of deliberate calm that Roman recognized as the voice of someone who had been in control of a situation for long enough that they no longer needed to perform it. "He's safe. For now." "That's entirely contingent on the next conversation we have, Roman." "Come alone. No Marco, no security." A pause. "You know where my apartment is." "Victor." Roman stood at the door of the safe house on the north side of Chicago, with his hand on the doorframe and his phone at his ear. And the thing that moved through him in that moment wasn't the panic he'd been managing all day, or the controlled fury, or the cold clarity of strategic thinking. It was something older and simpler and more dangerous than any of those things. It was the specific, devastating understanding that he had miscalculated at every stage of the last 2 weeks, that Victor had been 3 moves ahead of him the entire time, and that the woman he had once called nothing, the woman who had spent 22 months being quietly extraordinary in rooms full of people who didn't see her, was now sitting somewhere in Victor Soren's Gold Coast apartment, carrying Roman's child, because Roman Vale had been too proud and too blind and too certain of his own control to see the trap that had been closing around both of them. He lowered the phone. He looked at Marco across the room. "He has her," Roman said. Marco was on his feet before the sentence was finished. "Don't," Roman said. "Not yet." He was thinking, moving through it. "He called me. He wants me there. If he wanted to use her as a weapon without talking to me first, he would have made a different move. He wants a negotiation." He pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose. "He thinks he can get me to give him the organization. Control, succession rights, in exchange for her." "Can he?" Marco said. Roman looked at him. "He has her, Marco," Roman said, very quietly. "She's pregnant. She's alone. And every single thing I've done in the last 2 weeks has been one step behind him." He looked at the door. "So yes, he probably can." He pulled his coat tighter. "Unless I stop being who I've always been and start being something he hasn't planned for." Marco stared at him. "What does that mean?" Roman picked up his phone. He called Geiger back. Not because he trusted Geiger, he'd finished trusting Geiger about 3 hours ago. He called Geiger because Geiger was Victor's channel into the federal system, and that meant Geiger was about to become the most important mistake Victor had made, because Roman Vale was going to walk into Victor's apartment, and he was going to take nothing with him except the one thing he'd been refusing to use for his entire adult life. Truth. All of it. Unweaponed. Not as leverage, not as strategy, but as the only thing a man has left when every other tool has been taken away. The phone rang. Geiger answered, and Roman began to talk. "This is a work of complete cinematic fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely invented." Geiger picked up on the second ring, and Roman talked for 11 minutes straight. He didn't give Geiger time to respond, didn't leave gaps for the prosecutor to redirect or manage or calculate his next move. He laid out everything he knew the private investigator, the dossier on Elena, the billing trail back to Victor's holding company, the 7 weeks of advance knowledge about the pregnancy, the back channel between Victor and Geiger's office that Marco had traced through the investigative firm. He laid it out in the flat, sequential voice of a man reading a list of facts, because that's what they were, and when he finished, he said, "Victor Soren has Elena Marlowe in his Gold Coast apartment right now. She is 4 months pregnant. She is there against her will. Whatever arrangement you have with my uncle in the next 30 minutes, or every piece of documentation I just described, goes to 3 separate journalists I've had on standby for 2 years. Silence on the line. Roman, Geiger said. His voice had changed. The prosecutor's steadiness was still there, but underneath it, something had shifted, a recalibration happening in real time. What you're describing about my office. I'm not describing your office, Roman said. I'm describing you, specifically. The channel is yours, not the office's. Which means what you did is personal, not institutional, and the institutional protection you'd normally have doesn't apply. He paused. You have a choice to make right now. Help me get her out of that building safely, or I burn you along with Victor. Another silence. Longer. What do you need? Geiger said. 2 units outside the building. Unmarked. Not there to move in there to make Victor understand that the option of this staying quiet has expired. Roman was already walking to Marco's car. Can you do that in 30 minutes? 20, Geiger said and hung up. Roman got in the passenger seat. Marco was already behind the wheel. Gold Coast, Roman said. Marco pulled out. The drive took 14 minutes. Roman spent most of it looking out the window at the city, moving past the Saturday afternoon crowd, people with bags from the market, a couple arguing on a corner, a kid on a bike cutting between parked cars. The ordinary texture of a city that had no idea what was happening in a high-floor apartment 4 miles north. He had his phone in his hand, but he wasn't looking at it. He was doing the thing he did when he needed to be most precise, shutting everything down to a single point of focus, narrowing the field until there was only the next 30 minutes and what they required. He was scared. He recognized the feeling because it was rare enough that he couldn't confuse it with something else. It wasn't the operational tension he lived with routinely, the managed alertness of a man in a dangerous business. This was different. This was the specific fear that exists when the thing you might lose is something you've finally admitted you cannot replace, and it sat in his chest like a hand pressing from the inside, steady and insistent and entirely out of his control. He thought about Elena in that apartment. He thought about the way she moved when she was scared, the stillness, the precision, the way she went more exact when most people went more chaotic. He thought about a woman who had packed her bag and been ready to run from the moment she'd arrived at that bed and breakfast because she'd understood the threat better than he had from the beginning. She would be keeping herself calm right now. He was certain of it. She would be watching Victor, mapping the room, calculating. He needed her to hold for 30 more minutes, Marco, he said. Yeah. When we get there, you stay outside. Whatever you hear, whatever happens, you do not come up unless I call you. Marco's jaw tightened. Roman, he's expecting me to bring muscle, Roman said. Plan for it. The moment you come through that door, he has a reason to escalate. I need him to see one man walking in alone, because that's the only version of this where he thinks he's still in control. He looked at Marco's profile. I need him to think he's still in control. Marco drove. And if he's not interested in talking? Marco said. Roman looked at the road ahead. Then we find out what I'm actually made of, he said. Victor's building was a pre-war high-rise on the Gold Coast, the kind of address that announced money without needing to shout about it. Dark brick, a doorman, a lobby with marble floors and low lighting. Roman had been here before twice, for dinners that were really negotiations dressed as family occasions. He knew the layout, knew the elevator, knew the floor, knew the apartment door. He also knew, as he walked through the lobby with his hands visible and his pace unhurried, that Victor's 2 security men would be watching the camera feeds and would have clocked him the moment he came through the front entrance. He wasn't trying to be subtle. He was being exactly what Victor needed him to be, a man who had come because he had no other option. The doorman nodded at him. Roman nodded back. The elevator was slow and quiet. He rode it to the 14th floor and walked down the corridor to 14C and knocked 3 times. The door opened. The man who opened it was one of Victor's 2 security personnel, big, late 40s, a face that had taken some damage over the years and wore it without apology. He looked at Roman for a moment, then stepped back and let him in without speaking. Roman walked into the apartment. It was a large space. Victor's style expensive furniture, very clean. The kind of deliberate, tasteful arrangement that required regular professional attention. The living room was to the right, the kitchen beyond it, a hallway leading to bedrooms on the left. The second security man was standing near the hallway entrance. Victor was in the living room, and Elena was sitting on the couch. Roman saw her before he saw anything else in the room. She was upright, both feet on the floor, her hands folded in her lap, with the careful stillness he recognized. She was wearing the same dark pants he'd last seen her in and a heavy sweater. She looked at him when he walked in, and her expression did one thing, a single brief shift, there and gone, that told him she was all right. Shaken, furious, but all right. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked at Victor. His uncle was standing near the window, a glass of something amber in his hand, with the expression of a man who had planned this scene and was now performing in it. The warmth he'd been deploying in their conversations was gone, not because Victor had stopped performing, but because this was a different performance. The one where he was finally the man in charge. Roman Victor said, "Thank you for coming. Where's your other option?" Roman said. Victor tilted his head. "The option where you don't come," Roman said. "What was that?" "Because I want to understand what you would have done if I hadn't picked up the phone." Victor looked at him with something close to appreciation, the look of a man who recognizes a quality in an opponent he spent years waiting to see properly deployed. "I would have waited," he said. "You were always going to come." "You're sure about that?" "You called me from outside a federal building 3 hours ago." Victor's voice was even, almost gentle. "I've known where you were and what you were doing since you left your office this morning. Roman, I've been watching you for a long time. Longer than you've been watching me." Roman stayed on his feet. He didn't sit, he didn't move toward Elena. He kept his position near the entrance to the living room, where he could see both security men without turning his head, and he looked at his uncle and said, "What do you want?" "You know what I want. Say it." Victor set his glass down on the side table. "Succession," he said. "The board recognizes me as operational head. The holding structure transitions to my management. You retain whatever personal assets we agree on, and you step back. Publicly. A retirement. Health reasons, family reasons, we can construct whatever narrative serves." He looked at Elena. "She leaves. With whatever settlement makes her comfortable. The child is provided for. There's no reason any of this needs to be ugly." Roman was quiet. Elena was looking at him. Not with fear, not with the wordless plea of someone waiting to be rescued. She was looking at him with the focused, measuring attention she brought to everything, and he understood she was reading the situations, the same way she'd read contracts looking for the structural flaw, the clause that didn't hold. "Clean offer," Roman said. "It is," Victor agreed. "Why Elena?" Roman said. "Why bring her here? You had leverage already." "The board relationships, Dante, Geiger, because I needed you here," Victor said simply. "In this room. Without your phone directing your lawyers and your Marco and your various contingencies. I needed a conversation." He spread his hands. "This is the conversation." "So she's a prop," Roman said. Victor's expression shifted just slightly. "She's a complication," he said, "that I am offering to resolve cleanly." Dr. Roman's voice was very flat. "Look at me." His uncle looked at him. "I called Geiger an hour ago," Roman said. "I told him about the dossier, the investigative firm, the billing trail, the 14 months of surveillance." He watched Victor's face. "He has 2 units outside this building right now." The room changed. It was subtle, not a sound, not a movement, but the quality of the air in the apartment shifted the way it shifts when a room full of people simultaneously holds its breath. Victor's expression went through something Roman couldn't quite track, moving too fast. The security man near the window straightened slightly. The one by the hallway moved his weight forward. "You're bluffing," Victor said. "Call down to the lobby," Roman said. "Ask the doorman what's parked on the street." Victor didn't move. Roman watched his uncle's eyes. The thing happening behind them was the process of a man who's built an elaborate structure discovering, rapidly, that the foundation has a crack he didn't account for. Victor had planned for Roman the criminal, Roman the operator, the man who moved in shadows and avoided daylight by professional necessity. He had not fully planned for Roman the man who was willing to burn the shadows down. "You'd take yourself down with it," Victor said. "Yes," Roman said. "Everything. 15 years. The whole—" "Yes," Roman said again. Silence. Elena was still. Her hands were still folded in her lap. She was watching Victor with the attention of someone who has identified the structural flaw and is waiting for it to give. "Why?" Victor said, And for the first time in the conversation, his voice had something in it that wasn't performance. Something genuine and bewildered. For her? For a woman you call... Don't, Roman said. The word cut Victor off completely. It wasn't loud. It was the opposite of loud. But it landed with a weight that made the security man near the hallway take a half step back without appearing to realize he'd done it. Don't say what I called her, Roman said, because whatever I called her was the worst thing I've ever done, and I'm not going to stand here and let you use it as a reason to justify this. Victor stared at him. Let her go, Roman said. Roman. She walks out that door right now, and then you and I finish this conversation. He held Victor's eyes. You want the organization? Fine. We'll talk, but she leaves first. Victor looked at Elena, then back at Roman. He was calculating Roman could see it, the rapid reassessment, the checking of variables, the search for the angle that still worked. He was a man who had been playing this game for 60 years, and the game was not over yet, not in Victor's mind. He was looking for the move. All right, Victor said finally. She can go. He nodded at the security man near the hallway. The man moved. He went to Elena, reached down, and put his hand on her arm to help her up, not gently, not roughly. Just the impersonal grip of a man doing a directed task. Elena stood on her own. She didn't take the grip. She stood up without assistance, smoothed her sweater, and looked at Roman. He looked back at her. She held his gaze for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, packed with everything that couldn't be said in this room in front of these people. Then she nodded once, small, the specific nod of a woman who has understood something and intends to act on it, and she walked toward the door. Security man by the entrance moved to escort her. She paused at the door and looked back at Roman one more time. There's a red folder, she said. Roman looked at her. In the secondary filing system, she said. The one I built. Red folder labeled Contingency 3. Her voice was completely steady. Kept copies. Of everything. In case something like this happened. She looked at Victor when she said the last sentence. Then she walked out. The door closed. The apartment was very quiet for about 4 seconds. And Victor said, What is she talking about? Roman said nothing. Roman. Victor's voice had lost its evenness. The avuncular smoothness was gone, scraped away, and what was underneath it was something older, and less managed the hunger without the packaging. What copies? What does she have? Everything, Roman said. He said it simply, without inflection, the way you state a fact. Every internal document she handled for 2 years. The shell company structures, the import records, the port authority documentation. The board meeting minutes she transcribed. He looked at his uncle. She filed copies in a system I didn't know existed, that she built independently, with access controls only she had. Because she understood, from very early on, that she was operating in an environment where she needed insurance. Victor's face had gone very still. She's smarter than either of us, Roman said. She's been smarter than both of us this entire time. Where are the copies? Victor's voice was controlled but thin. Roman. Where I don't know, Roman said. And it was true. He didn't. Elena had built her contingency without telling him, which was exactly what he would have done in her position. Only she knows. Victor turned away from him. He walked to the window and stood there looking out at the Chicago skyline with his back to Roman, and Roman watched his uncle's shoulders and understood he was watching a man process the collapse of a plan he'd spent over a year constructing. The architecture crumbling, the careful structure giving way. Then Victor turned back around, and in his right hand was a gun. Roman had not seen him pick it up. It had been at his waist, under his jacket, which Roman had known was possible and had been tracking for this possibility. But Victor had moved faster than Roman had anticipated, and now the weapon was between them in the way that guns change rooms, irreversibly. Where is she going? Victor said. Roman looked at the gun. Then at Victor. Put that down, Roman said. Where's she going, Roman? Victor. Roman's voice was as flat and steady as he could make it, but his heart was doing something against his sternum that had nothing to do with steadiness. There are 2 federal units outside this building right now. You know that. Shooting me in this apartment is the end of everything your freedom, your assets, everything you've spent 60 years building. She has the documents, Victor said. If she gets to Geiger is compromised, Roman said. I told him that an hour ago. She won't go to Geiger. Then where is she going? I don't know, Roman said again. You're lying, I'm not. He took one slow step forward. Victor, look at me. Look at what you're doing. His uncle's hand was not entirely steady. Roman registered this, filed it, assessed it, felt the fear it produced, and set the fear aside because there was no room for it right now. Victor Sorin was 61 years old, and he was holding a gun on his nephew in a Gold Coast apartment with federal units on the street below. And the thing Roman understood about this moment was that Victor was not fully in control of it anymore. He'd been in control of every piece of this for 14 months. And in the last 40 minutes, it had slipped. Men who lose control of situations they've spent months engineering are the most dangerous version of themselves. Roman knew this, had seen it, had studied it the way a pilot studies what happens when a plane loses both engines, not because he planned to be in that situation, but because you needed to know what the descent looked like. I will find her, Victor said, whether you help me or not. And if those documents reach anyone, the documents are already in motion, Roman said. Victor, listen to me. It's done. Whatever you do in the next 5 minutes, it's done. The only question is what happens to you. Victor stared at him. The gun didn't lower. The security man near the window had moved. Roman clocked it in his peripheral vision, a slow shift of weight. The man trying to decide whose direction he was actually working in now that the situation had migrated somewhere unplanned. Roman took another step toward his uncle. Don't, Victor said. You're not going to shoot me, Roman said. Roman, you're not going to shoot me because I'm your brother's son, and because you've spent 60 years wanting what my father had and shooting me in this room is the absolute end of any version of that, and you know it. He took another step. He was close now, closer than was safe, close enough to smell the whiskey on Victor's breath and see the thing happening behind his uncle's eyes, the calculation fracturing. Put it down. Victor's hand was shaking now, not a lot, but enough. She ruined this, Victor said. His voice had gone somewhere. Roman hadn't heard before, not the polished performance, not the cold strategy. Something raw and wrong, like a gear that had slipped. Everything I built, everything I planned, because you looked at some contract lawyer like she was. She is, Roman said, whatever I looked at her like she is. Victor's jaw worked. Roman reached out slowly, very slowly, telegraphing every inch of the movement, and put his hand over his uncle's, over the gun, and pressed down. Not fighting, not resting, just wait. Just the quiet insistence of a man who has run out of any other option except the physical fact of his own presence. For a moment, Victor resisted. Then the gun lowered. Roman took it from his uncle's hand. He stepped back. His hands were not entirely steady either, he noticed, which was fair. His shirt was damp at the back. His breathing was working harder than he wanted it to. He looked at the gun in his hand for a moment, then set it on the side table behind him. He looked at his uncle. Victor Sorin looked, for the first time in Roman's memory, old. Not dignified old, not silver-haired and patrician old. Just old. A man at the end of something, aware of it, not yet knowing what came after. Sit down, Victor, Roman said. His uncle sat. Roman pulled out his phone and called Marco. Come up, he said. Bring whoever Geiger sent. He hung up. He looked at his uncle one more time, and then he looked at the window at the Chicago skyline, the lake beyond it, the flat gray November sky pressing down on the city that had made the Vale family and would outlast it without pausing. I'm going to ask you something, Roman said, and I need a true answer. Victor looked at him. How many people know where Elena was tonight? Before she left? Victor was quiet for a moment. 2, he said, myself and one of my men. Which one? Victor nodded toward the security man near the window. Roman looked at the man. The man looked back at him with the expression of someone who is rapidly recalculating his professional future. And the man who went after her at the bed and breakfast. Independent contractor, Victor said, no longer a concern. Roman processed this. Independent contractor, someone brought in specifically for that action. Someone who didn't have ongoing knowledge of the situation. Which meant the leak was contained to Victor's immediate circle, not distributed through the organization. Which meant Elena was probably safe. Probably. The word sat in his chest like a splinter. He heard the elevator in the corridor, then footsteps, then a knock. Marco came in with 2 federal agents, not Geiger, 2 others, both with the specific manner of people who were working from sudden orders and moving carefully. Roman looked at the agents. Victor Sorin, he said. I'll give you a statement tonight. Everything. But first I need 30 minutes. He held one of the agent's eyes. I need to find someone. The agent looked at Victor. At the gun on the side table. At the two security men who had very carefully assumed the positions of people with nothing to do and nowhere in particular to be. 20 minutes, the agent said. Roman was already moving. He went down in the elevator alone, his hand pressed against the back wall of the car, feeling the cool metal against his palm, using the sensation the way he'd taught himself to use physical sensation to anchor, to locate, to bring himself back into his body from whatever altitude the last 40 minutes had taken him to. His shirt was damp. His hands had steadied, but his chest hadn't. He breathed the lobby, the front door, the street. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and honest. He stood on the sidewalk outside Victor's building in the November night and called Elena's number. It rang a second time, a third. On the fourth ring, she picked up. I'm outside, she said. 2 blocks south. I've been here for 10 minutes. He exhaled. It came out more ragged than he'd intended, a sound he hadn't made in years, the sound of something held very tightly, releasing itself. And he was glad he was outside and alone, because he would not have wanted anyone to hear it. Are you all right? He said. I'm fine. Her voice had the flat steadiness of someone running on adrenaline and will. Is it over? Victor's with federal agents, he said. Yes, this part is over. A pause. You took the gun, she said. He stopped. How do you? The security man near the hallway walked me to the elevator, and I could hear through the door, she said. I waited. I needed to know what was happening before I moved. She'd been standing in the hallway outside the apartment, listening. Of course she had, Elena, he said. I know, she said quietly. No, I need to say it. He stopped. Started again. Copies you made. The contingency system. You built that because you knew there might come a point where you had nothing left except those documents. You built your own insurance inside an operation that was mine, that you had every reason not to protect yourself from, because I never gave you a reason to think I was a threat. He was looking at the street, at the cold concrete, at the yellow light of the building across the way. I was a threat. I didn't protect you. Everything that happened tonight, Victor the investigator, your sister being approached, that's on me. All of it. Silence. I know, she said again, softer. I'm not asking for anything, he said. I'm not asking you to. I'm not using this as a trade. I just needed to say it out loud. He heard her breathing on the other end of the line. The particular sound of someone deciding whether to speak or stay quiet, and choosing, finally, to speak. Come find me, she said. I'm at the corner of Dearborn and Schiller. There's a drugstore with a green awning. I'm coming, he said. He started walking south, into the cold, his hands in his pockets, and his chest still doing the thing it had been doing since he'd walked into Victor's apartment and seen Elena sitting on that couch. The city moved around him. The lake wind came in off the water, 2 blocks east, cutting through everything. He walked faster. He was half a block away when he saw her standing under the green awning of the drugstore exactly where she'd said, her arms crossed against the cold, her bag on her shoulder, her hair loose around her face. She saw him at the same moment he saw her, and she didn't move, just watched him come, the way she watched everything completely. He reached her. He stopped. They were standing on a cold Chicago sidewalk on a Saturday night in November, with federal agents 2 blocks north, and a criminal empire in the process of coming apart, and a baby between them that neither had asked for and both already felt responsible for. Roman Vale looked at Elena Marlowe, and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Then she said, You took the gun from a man who was pointing it at you. Yes, he said, without fighting him for it. Yes. She looked at him with those eyes that missed nothing, that had never missed anything, in 22 months of watching him operate, and she said, That's not what you used to be. No, he said, it's not. The wind moved between them. Elena unfolded her arms. She reached out and took hold of his sleeve, not his hand, just the sleeve, the fabric of his coat, and held on to it for a moment. Okay, she said, just that one word. And Roman Vale stood on a street corner in the city that had made him, and was in the process of unmaking him. And he felt the grip on his sleeve, and he thought about a 2-line test on a desk, and 4 words he could not take back. And a woman who had spent 22 months being the most important person in every room she entered, without anyone saying so. And he thought that whatever came next, the federal agents, the statements, The end of everything he'd built, whatever came next, started here. On this corner, with one word and a hand on his sleeve. Covered her hand with his. She didn't pull away. This is a work of complete cinematic fiction, created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely invented. They stood on that corner for 3 minutes before Roman's phone rang. It was one of the federal agents from the building, the one who had given him 20 minutes. The 20 minutes were up. Roman answered, confirmed he was coming back, and looked at Elena. I have to go back up there, he said. I know, she said. I don't want to leave you on a street corner. I've been on street corners before, she said. There was no edge to it, just the fact. He looked at her for a moment. The cold working into her cheeks, the way she held herself straight, contained. The posture of someone who had learned a long time ago that the world did not make room for you unless you held your ground in it. She was 4 months pregnant, and she'd been abducted, and she'd stood in a hallway outside a room where a man was pointing a gun at someone, and she was standing on a sidewalk in November telling him she'd been on street corners before. Marco's outside the building, he said. I'm going to call him. He'll stay with you until I'm done. She started to object. Elena, he said, please. She closed her mouth. He called Marco, who was around the corner and came quickly, and Roman watched Marco arrive and position himself at a respectful distance, close enough, far enough, and then Roman looked at Elena one more time and went back to Victor's building. Statement took 4 hours. Roman sat in the apartment that had been, 2 hours ago, the site of the most frightening 20 minutes of his adult life, and he talked to 2 federal agents and a prosecutor, who was not Geiger, a different one. A woman named Stern, who had the manner of someone who had been woken from sleep and was not pleased about it, but was absolutely awake now, and he gave them everything. He'd already given Geiger a significant portion of it over the phone. Now he gave Stern the structural anatomy of 15 years, in detail, in sequence, from the moment he'd taken over operational control from his father, through every major transaction and relationship and legal architecture that Elena had helped construct. He was careful about Elena. He was specific and deliberate about the nature of her work, its scope, its limits, what she'd known and what she hadn't, what she'd done and what she hadn't. He constructed, in the course of that 4 hours, the most thorough and accurate account of Elena's role that could possibly protect her. Stern listened without expression. She asked precise, intelligent questions. She had clearly read whatever Geiger had filed before his own situation had become complicated, and she was cross-referencing in real time. At one point she said Miss Marlowe's copies, the contingency documents she mentioned. That's her decision, Roman said. I can't speak to those. You'd need to talk to her directly. We will, Stearns said. With her attorney present, Roman said, and the immunity agreement signed first. Stern looked at him with the flat, measuring gaze of a woman who had probably heard every variety of negotiating tactic available and was not impressed by any of them. You're in no position to be setting terms, Mr. Vale. I'm in the exact position to be setting terms for Elena Marlowe, Roman said. Everything else, my position, my assets, my exposure, I'll deal with as it comes. But her immunity is not negotiable, and it's not contingent on anything I give you. It's the condition of the cooperation, and if it's not met, I'll find a different attorney than the one I currently have, and we'll start over. Pause. Sign before the week is out, Stern said. That's what I can give you. That works, Roman said. It was almost 3 in the morning by the time they finished. Victor had been taken from the apartment sometime. During the second hour, Roman heard the movement without seeing it, the quiet procedural machinery of an arrest being executed with minimum disruption. 2 security men were dealt with separately. Roman didn't know the details and didn't ask. When Stern finally closed her notebook and stood, she looked at Roman with an expression that wasn't sympathetic exactly, but had something in it that wasn't purely prosecutorial either. You understand what you've handed us, she said. The full scope. Yes, Roman said, and you understand your own exposure. I have an attorney, he said. We'll negotiate. She nodded. Don't leave the city. I'm not going anywhere, he said. She left. Marco drove him home. They didn't talk for most of the drive. At some point, Marco said, Elena's at a hotel on Michigan. I put her in a room under my wife's maiden name. She said she was tired. A pause. She looked tired. She's been running for 2 weeks, Roman said. Yeah, Marco drove. Roman. What happens now? To the organization. It's done, Roman said. Marco was quiet. The people who just worked for the operation, legitimate employees, people with real jobs in the surface companies, most of them will be fine. Stern's not interested in the bottom of the food chain. He looked out the window. The rest of it, the actual structure, it's done. Marco drove another block before he said, 15 years. I know, Roman said. I'm not complaining, Marco said carefully. I know, Roman said again. And he did. 15 years was not nothing. 15 years was Marco's career, his income, the professional identity he'd built inside a structure that was now collapsing. Roman would have to think about Marco, about a lot of people. That was a problem for the next week, the next month. There were going to be a great many problems for a great many weeks and months. He was not afraid of them. That surprised him slightly, the absence of the fear he would have expected. He felt exhausted and hollowed out, and his shoulder ached from a tension he'd been holding. For so long he'd stopped noticing it, but he didn't feel the particular dread he'd anticipated at the idea of the structure coming down. He felt something closer to the specific relief of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and has finally, in the most brutal possible way, been required to put it down. He slept until 10 the next morning and woke up in his own apartment for the first time in what felt like weeks, in a bed that felt unfamiliar with the quality of something that has changed slightly in your absence. He lay there for a while looking at the ceiling. He thought about his father, about the gun his father had put in his hand when he was 24, and the lesson his father had called wisdom, and Roman had called necessity for 15 years. He thought about Elena's voice on a phone line, saying, figure out who you actually are, and the fact that the answer to that question, it turned out, required burning down the architecture he'd spent 15 years, building before the real thing underneath it could be seen clearly. Thought about the word nothing, and what it costs when you say it carelessly, and how a single sentence in a crowded room can undo 2 years of every quieter thing you meant and never said. He got up. He called his attorney, a legitimate one, a woman named Park, who had handled his personal legal affairs separately from the organization for years, and who was, Roman was fairly certain, both clean and very good. Told her what had happened. The conversation took an hour and was not comfortable, but Park was exactly what he needed, someone who moved quickly and asked the right questions and did not waste time with anything except the problem in front of her. Best case, Park said, you're looking at a negotiated plea. Significant cooperation credit, given the scope of what you're handing them. Possible community supervision rather than incarceration, depending on Stern's appetite and the judge. Case, she paused. Let's work toward best case. What do I need to do, Roman said. She told him. He spent the rest of Sunday doing it. He went to see Elena on Monday afternoon. He didn't call ahead. He called Marco and got the hotel name and the room number, and he went, and he stood outside the door for a moment, with his hand raised to knock, and thought about everything that had been said in the last 3 weeks. And then he knocked. She opened the door. She looked better than she had Saturday night she'd slept. He could tell, and eaten something, and the particular edge of sustained adrenaline had faded from her face, leaving something quieter and more tired and more real. She was in loose clothes, a sweater he hadn't seen before, her hair up. She looked at him. Come in, she said. The room was a standard hotel room, neat, impersonal, Elena's single bag in the corner, a laptop open on the desk with a legal document visible on the screen that she closed as he came in. He sat in the chair near the window. She sat on the edge of the bed. They were about 6 feet apart. How are you feeling? He said. Physically fine, she said. The baby's fine. I checked in with the doctor this morning. She folded her hands in her lap, the familiar posture. I have an appointment with a proper OB on Wednesday. Good, he said, a pause. Stern's office called me this morning, Elena said. I know. I told them to reach out. They want the documents. It's your decision, he said, entirely. I'm not asking you to use them for my benefit. If handing them over helps you, do it. If you need to hold them, hold them. Park my attorney, she can connect you with someone good, if you don't have representation yet. I called someone this morning, she said. An attorney I worked with before all of this. A slight pause. Before you. He nodded. The room was quiet. Traffic from outside muffled by the window glass. Particular quiet of 2 people in a room who have been through something together and are now in the aftermath of it, which has its own specific texture, neither the crisis nor the resolution, just the bare exhausted fact of what remains. Dante, she said. He's cooperating, Roman said. He made his own calculation. He looked at his hands. He'll probably get a better deal than he deserves. Does that bother you? He thought about it honestly. No, he said, not really. Dante was what he was. I knew what he was, and I kept him because he was useful. That's on me. Elena looked at him for a moment. Victor's being charged, she said. Yes, multiple counts. He won't see the outside of a courtroom for a long time. He paused. His 2 security men have been cooperative. The independent contractor, the one he sent to the bed and breakfast Stearns people, found him. He'll be charged too, my sister, Elena said. Clara doesn't know the full extent of what the investigator was doing, Roman said. She answered questions she thought were routine. She has no exposure. He looked at Elena directly. I'm sorry she was brought into it. I should have. There were a dozen points where I should have moved faster, and I didn't. And your sister being approached is one of the consequences of that. Elena held his gaze. She called me this morning, she said. I told her I was fine. I didn't tell her everything. You don't have to tell her everything. I know, Elena said. I'll decide what she's to know when I've decided what I need to know. She unfolded her hands and folded them again. What happens to you, Roman, legally? Park is negotiating, he said. Significant cooperation credit. It won't be nothing. There will be consequences. He said it plainly without trying to soften it. I don't know the exact shape yet. I'll know more by the end of the week. Are you scared? She said. He looked at her. Yes, he said. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she nodded slowly, the nod of someone accepting an honest answer. What about the assets? She said. Most of them will be seized or surrendered as part of the agreement, he said. The building, the club, the holding interests. Most of the accounts. He paused. There are some legitimate personal assets that Park believes I can retain. Enough. I'm not going to be, he stopped. I'm not going to be Roman Vale the way I've been Roman Vale. That's done. Who are you going to be? She said. The question landed the way questions land when they've been asked before in a different form, and you've spent the intervening time actually working on the answer. He looked at the window, at the gray Chicago November sky that had been pressing down on this city for the entire 3 weeks of this disaster. I don't fully know yet, he said. I know I'm going to be the father of your child, if you'll let me be. I know I'm going to be someone who doesn't run a criminal organization, which is a significant change in job description. He looked back at her. I know I'm going to be someone who doesn't say things carelessly, or at least someone who tries very hard not to. She looked at him. I'm not coming back to Chicago, she said. Not to live. Not in the immediate future. I know, he said. I need to be somewhere quiet. Somewhere the baby can be born without all of this surrounding it. I know, he said again. And I'm not making any decisions about us right now. About what we are, what we might be. Her voice was even and honest. I've spent 2 years making decisions about you and me based on what I hoped was there instead of what I could see clearly. I'm not doing that again. He took this. He sat with it and didn't try to answer it or argue it or offer the counter case because Elena was right. And she had been right about most things for 22 months. And the very least he owed her was to receive the truth of what she was saying without immediately trying to manage it. He said. She looked at him as if she'd expected something else. Then something in her face shifted, not softening exactly, but settling, the way a thing settles when the weight it was braced against doesn't materialize. The baby's due in late April, she said. I know, he said. You're about 16 weeks. She looked at him. You told me on the phone from Wisconsin, he said. You said you found out about 6 weeks before you left. Calculated. A pause. Something moved through her expression that wasn't amusement exactly, but lived in the same neighborhood, the involuntary recognition of a detail noticed and retained. I'm going to my sister's, she said, in Milwaukee. For now. She has space and she's been asking me to visit for years, and right now I need. She stopped. People who love you without complication, he said. Yes, she said. Clara will be good for that, he said. He'd never met Clara. He knew her name and her city, and the fact that she'd answered questions from a stranger, thinking it was an insurance inquiry. He knew nothing else. But he knew that Elena had spent 22 months being someone steady and careful, and alone inside a dangerous orbit, and that she needed, right now, the specific warmth of someone who loved her before any of this existed. "I'll send you the address," Elena said, "when I'm settled. If you want to be involved in the pregnancy," and she paused. "I'm not shutting you out. I want you to know that. I'm not doing this to punish you." "I know," he said. "I'm doing it because I need to be a person again," she said. "Before I can figure out what kind of person I am next to you." He looked at her, at the woman he had spent 22 months keeping at the precise distance of usefulness, close enough to benefit from her intelligence, far enough that he could pretend she didn't matter. The woman who had built a contingency system inside his own operation because she'd understood from early on that she needed insurance. The woman who had stood in a hallway outside a room where a man held a gun and had stayed to listen, because she needed information, because she was always gathering information, always protecting herself with everything available. He thought about what kind of person she was next to him. He thought about what kind of person he was going to need to become before that question had an answer worth giving her. "Take the time you need," he said. He stood up. She stood too, not to show him out, just because she was Elena, and she didn't sit while other people stood. They were close enough that he could see the specific exhaustion around her eyes, the kind that sleep helps but doesn't entirely fix, the exhaustion of weeks. "Roman," she said. He looked at her. "The night in the club," she said. "When you said it." Her voice was completely steady. "I need you to know that the worst part wasn't the words. The worst part was that I wasn't surprised." He stood with that. "I'd been telling myself for months that I was wrong," she said. "That it was more than it looked like. And I kept choosing to stay anyway, that's on me. I made those choices." She looked at him with the direct, unsparing attention she'd always brought to everything. "But the words were just the thing that made me stop lying to myself." So in a way she stopped. "In a way," he said carefully. "In a way I needed to hear them," she said, "as terrible as that is." He looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who could find the structural utility in her own worst experience, not to minimize it, not to forgive it, but to understand it clearly and use the understanding. He thought this was either the most remarkable thing he'd ever seen or the saddest, and then he thought it was probably both. "I needed to say them," he said, "to finally understand what they cost." She held his gaze. Then she stepped forward and did something he hadn't expected. She put her arms around him, briefly, the way you hold on to something you're not sure you're allowed to hold on to, brief and real and without performance. He held on. She stepped back. She looked at him once more, and then she looked at the door, which was the clearest possible signal, and he went to it. He put his hand on the handle. "April," he said, without turning around. "Late April," she said. "I'll send you the address." He opened the door and walked out. The months that followed had a texture Roman hadn't expected. He'd anticipated the legal proceedings, the negotiation, the specific grinding discomfort of a man in his position being processed through a system he'd spent 15 years avoiding. Park was good, better than good, and the cooperation credit was substantial, and Stern proved to be, beneath her flat prosecutorial surface, someone who wanted the case built correctly, more than she wanted Roman Vale destroyed specifically. The plea agreement took 6 weeks to finalize. When it was done, Roman signed it at Park's office on a Tuesday afternoon in January, and Park said something quiet and professional about the next steps. And Roman nodded and thanked her, and went outside and stood on the sidewalk in the January cold and felt the specific sensation of a door closing behind him that would never open again. He was not incarcerated. The terms included significant financial restitution, 3 years of supervised release, mandatory cooperation with ongoing investigations, and a prohibition on involvement in any financial enterprise above a certain threshold for 5 years. He was allowed to remain in Illinois. He was allowed, essentially, to live just not the life he'd built. He sold the apartment in January and moved to a smaller place on the north side, a 2-bedroom in a building full of people who had jobs and routines and who did not know his name and had no particular interest in learning it. He found this, to his own surprise, more comfortable than the apartment he'd spent 15 years in. The silence was different, less managed. He'd sent Elena a check in December, not a large one, not a gesture designed to impress, just a practical amount to cover expenses while she was at her sister's. She'd returned it with a note that said simply, "I have savings. I'm fine." He hadn't sent another one, he waited. She sent the address in January. Milwaukee, Clara's neighborhood, a house on a quiet street that Elena described in a single line of the text, as noisier than she'd expected because Clara had 2 kids under 7. He'd written back, "Give them time to get used to you." She'd written, "They already have. It's me getting used to them." They texted with increasing regularity after that. Not long exchanges as Elena was economical with words, in the same way she was economical with everything. No excess, no waste. But regular. He'd send something about the legal proceedings. She'd send something about an appointment, a detail about how she was feeling, a dry observation about Milwaukee in the winter. Once she sent him a photo of a lake gray and frozen and flat with the text, "Reminds me of the first lake." Colder. He'd stared at that for a long time. He drove to Milwaukee in March. He didn't stay. He came for an afternoon, sat at Clara's kitchen table while Clara made coffee, and watched him with the specific scrutiny of an older sister who had been told some version of this story and had formed opinions about it. Clara was 42 and worked as a nurse and had her sister's eyes and a directness that was slightly less contained than Elena's, which Roman found he respected immediately. Clara had put a mug in front of him and said, "You know you really messed her up." "Yes," he said. Clara had looked at him for a long moment. Then she'd poured her own coffee and sat down and said, "She's also the most together I've seen her in years." Complicated. Elena came downstairs 20 minutes later. She was visibly pregnant. By then the sweater she was wearing couldn't hide it, and she moved differently, a slight adjustment to her gait, a hand that went unconsciously to her side when she sat. She sat across from Roman at Clara's kitchen table, and they talked for 2 hours while Clara came and went, and the kids erupted periodically in other rooms, and the ordinary machinery of a family's Saturday afternoon moved around them. They talked about the legal proceedings, about his supervised release conditions, about Elena's attorney who had negotiated an immunity agreement that Stern's office had signed in January. The documents Elena had preserved in her contingency system were now part of the federal case against Victor and 3 of his associates, including Dante, whose cooperation deal had ended up being considerably less generous than Dante had hoped. Elena had sat in Stern's office for 6 hours over 2 days. She'd been, by all accounts, the best witness Stern had ever worked with, precise, thorough, completely composed. "How was that?" Roman asked. "Strange," she said. "Building the case against the thing I'd built the case for." She looked at the table. "I kept thinking about all the work I'd done, all the structures I'd designed. They were good structures, technically, legally airtight." A pause. "I was good at protecting something that didn't deserve protecting." "You were good at your job," Roman said. "The job was mine. The job was wrong." She looked at him. "I knew what I was working on." "You knew it was unusual," he said. "There's a line between that and—" "Roman," she said, "I'm not looking for absolution. I'm telling you the truth of how it felt." She picked up her coffee. "I'm done managing the truth of how things feel." He held that. "Fair," he said. When he left that afternoon, Clara walked him to the door and said quietly, while Elena was in the kitchen, "She talks about you." A pause. "Not the way I expected. Not angry. Just like you're a problem she's still working on." "She likes problems she can work on," Roman said. Clara looked at him with her sister's eyes. "Don't be a problem she can't solve," she said. He drove back to Chicago thinking about that. Noah was born on April 29th. Roman was in Milwaukee by 8 in the morning. Elena had texted him at 6. A single line, the tone entirely practical. "It's starting. You can come." He'd driven 90 miles in, slightly under an hour and a half, and had been in the hospital waiting area, in a chair with bad padding, for 4 hours before Clara came out and looked at him with an expression that was complicated and warm in equal measure and said, "She's asking for you." He was not prepared. He understood this the moment he walked through the door and saw Elena in the bed, tired in a way that went beyond any tired he'd seen her be, and saw the small bundled weight in her arms, and understood that every important thing that had ever happened to him had been merely leading to the specific coordinates of this room on this morning. He sat in the chair beside her bed. She looked at him, and her face did the thing it almost never did. It came fully open, without any of the management, without the careful precision. She just looked at him, and she was exhausted, and she'd been through something enormous and physical and real, and she was holding his son. And she said, "Come look." He looked. The boy was very small, He was red-faced and entirely unimpressed with his circumstances and had Elena's forehead and something around the eyes that Roman couldn't locate on anyone specific and would spend a long time thinking about later. He was the most real thing Roman Vale had ever seen. Real in the specific, non-negotiable way of things that have just arrived in the world and have no interest in your categories or your history or your carefully managed self-presentation. "What are we calling him?" Roman said. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. Elena looked at the boy. "I've been thinking about Noah," she said. "Noah," he said. "If that's all right, it's all right," he said. "It's exactly right." He put his hand out, and Elena shifted the boy slightly, and Noah's small fist the size of nothing, the size of a held breath, made contact with Roman's finger and gripped it with the automatic, indiscriminate grip of a person who has just arrived and is holding on to whatever is available. Roman sat with that grip and did not say anything for a long time. Elena watched him. Her face was still open, still unmanaged. She was too tired for anything else, and he was grateful for it, grateful that she didn't have the energy to protect herself from this moment, because he didn't either, and he would not have wanted to be alone in it. "Roman," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not ready to say what this is," she said. Her voice was quiet and direct. "Between us, I need more time. I need to see." "I know," he said. "But I want you here," she said. "For him." And she stopped, looked at the boy, looked back at Roman. "And for whatever it becomes. Between us, I want it to be possible." He looked at her for a long time. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She held his gaze. Then she looked down at Noah, and he looked down at Noah, and the room was very quiet, except for the particular sounds of a hospital, on an April morning, distant footsteps, a door somewhere, the low hum of something mechanical and indifferent, and inside that quiet Roman Vale sat beside the woman he'd called nothing, and held the finger of the son she'd named Noah, and he thought about a version of himself that put a gun in a young man's hand and called it wisdom, and he thought about what it meant to actually put something down. Not dramatically, not as a grand gesture, just the simple, exhausting, daily act of setting the weight down and leaving it there. He stayed for 3 hours. He held Noah once Elena transferred him with careful, precise instructions, the way she did everything, and sat with the boy against his chest and felt the weight of him and the warmth and the particular, terrifying fragility. And he thought, this is what the word heir means now. Not a legacy, not a succession, not a future built on what came before. Just this weight, this grip, this small, furious face. When he left, Elena was almost asleep. He stood at the door for a moment. "I'll come back Thursday," he said. "Okay," she said, half asleep, her voice soft in a way it almost never was. He went out into the April morning, into a Milwaukee parking lot, where a light rain was coming down, not the heavy November rain of 3 weeks ago in Chicago, but a soft spring rain, the kind that smells like things returning. He stood in the parking lot and let it hit his face for a moment. Then he got in his car and drove. He drove back toward Chicago, toward the supervised release check-in he had that afternoon, toward the 2-bedroom apartment and the quiet and the ordinary grinding work of a man rebuilding something without a blueprint. He drove past the flat Midwestern fields that were starting, finally, to show the faint green of something new, and he thought about April 29th and the grip of a hand the size of nothing on his finger. He thought about 4 words he'd said in a nightclub, and the woman who had heard them and chosen, finally to make him understand what they cost. He thought about the question she'd asked him by a lake in November, "Figure out who you actually are," and he thought that the answer was still incomplete, still forming, still the project of a man who had a long way to go and no map for the territory. But he was going. That was the thing. He was going. And he knew the direction, and he had, for the first time in 15 years, nothing in his hands that wasn't his to carry. The rain came down on the windshield, and the fields moved past, and somewhere in Milwaukee a boy named Noah was sleeping in his mother's arms, completely unaware that he had already changed everything. The way new things do not by being large or powerful or carefully constructed, but simply by arriving and being real and holding on.